So archtivism, in a nutshell, is the delightful blend of architecture and activism. So archtivism. And it's really a movement of built environment and architects and all the people who are involved in the built environment in the profession, but also enthusiasts who are working towards creating more inclusive, more just, more regenerative, more resilient cities or built environments. So who are really working towards having some kind of impact within the built environment. And so it's quite a broad term. Let's say that architecture is somewhat of a elitist kind of profession. Architect is a protected title, and within reason, yeah. But the idea behind archtivism is to open that up and to open this idea of being able to have a part of making the city, regardless of our professional background or any other type of background that we might have. And so archtivism is much more inclusive, and it goes beyond the profession. And I think there's so many people who are a part of making cities better in so many different ways that it's nice to bring us all together within one movement and not think of us as all separate parts or siloed. I think what we need now is to have a much more a feeling of being together and working towards one common goal, which is in the end what we're doing. Thinking about what archtivism is criticizing, or what it's why it came to be, so why archtivism came to be, is if we go back to a bit the origin story of archtivism in a sense, I think it started when I was studying my bachelor's degree in architecture in Paris, and I always wanted to be an architect. I always wanted to have an impact through buildings and through the city. It was something that I was from very young, very passionate and enthusiastic about. And when I started school in Paris, I was a bit taken aback by how traditional the curriculum was that we were taught. And one of the things was that one of my studio classes, my teacher was very adamant about the fact that we should follow in Le Corbusier's footsteps, and that this is architecture with a capital A. And I was a bit taken aback by why we would follow so blindly something from 100 years back. But I think that, yeah, there's this an idea of modernism and how architecture came to be in the 20th century that is very present, or was very present in my education. And so archtivism was born in a way, a rebuttal to that, something to counter this idea that archtivism is only about form, or still about style, or things that are more in the shape, or esoteric subjects that only other architects can understand. Which I felt was very much not in line with my being, with my multicultural background, with my millennial purpose-seeking mindset, and not at all in line with the 21st century issues that we were dealing with, though we are dealing with today. And I thought architecture is not an end, where sometimes it was taught a bit like, it's the end to something, but it's more a means to creating a better future. And so that's where archtivism started, in this, in a way, thinking, how can we do things differently than what I was being taught originally? And I think within this context of Paris, what another thing that maybe influenced coming up with this idea of this movement of archtivism is art history. Was one of my favorite classes when I was studying, and I was always very intrigued by how there was this duality between tradition, innovation, and challenging the status quo within the context of Paris, which in a way lots of movements were born, Impressionism, Cubism, Surrealism, were born within this context. And somehow I think that context also was happening there, where we had this this duality between the basics, the traditional sense of things, and ultimately Le Corbusier was a radical. I mean, of his time, he really was trying to do. He had some radical ideas that we question today, but in essence, he was really trying to do. Have impact for these, you know, overcrowded cities of the time, and how could architecture be a vehicle for creating better cities? And that's basically more what we should be taking from Le Corbusier than stylistically or any other aspect. And so archtivism is a rebuttal to that. And when Le Corbusier has his 5 points of architecture, I like to think of 5 points of archtivism, but also, yeah, his book Towards an Architecture, this idea, I think the 21st century needs towards archtivism much more. A system change, not thinking of form, but thinking of more how we design or what the values are that we are designing the world with. So reference men, I also met I was acquainted with him in school in Paris, in architecture school. And it was in the form of Le Corbusier's Modular Man. And this was, you know, if you designed for this guy, you know, you designed for everyone, you had all the proportions, this is how you should do a table, this is how these heights, everything. And I thought it made quite a lot of sense, and I designed a lot of things in school based on reference men. And it's only later that I started to realize this reference is not at all representative of the world. So reference man is this 1.80 meters or so heterosexual, able-bodied white man, upper middle class or so. Who is used as this standard to design everything, and it goes beyond the built environment, but within the built environment, all of the spaces that we use, the streets, the size of the streets, the buildings, everything is kind of used on this one basis. And it completely disregards women, the elderly, children, people of color, LGBTQ+ people with disabilities. And I think even most men, like, it's not at all representative of anyone in the end. And by hyper-focusing on this one standard, we make spaces that are very exclusive. And it's something we try to use this as a way to make sense, I guess, of the complexity of the full array of human uniqueness. I mean, it's a complex thing to be able to grasp designing for everyone. But designing for this one guy is definitely not the way to go. So I think it's important to first recognize that we are designing for reference man when we're designing for all as well, because then we try to have this sort of blanket standard that's supposed to be, yeah, for everyone. So recognize that first, and then afterwards start to be more specific with how we design, start to look at how we can design for more marginalized groups. And I always feel that when we are more specific, that in the end we can end up designing something that's much more inclusive, and that each designer has maybe different focuses, and in the end we end up with a patchwork of a much more diverse, much more inclusive city. Yeah, the ingredients of architecture that embodies archtivism, I think, are more to do with the process and more to do with the how than the end result. So it doesn't look a certain way. There's not a picture that I can paint for you and say, this is how it is. And which sometimes is a bit daunting, because then it feels a bit less clear or more complex. But I think that that's what it is. It's not about having one one result, but having many different, and having a much more inclusive process to get there. And so first with reference man, it starts with designing beyond reference man, so ditching him and thinking about how we can design for other users and how we can design with other users, how the decision makers can represent other people than reference men, how the designers can also be much more diverse. And I think that once we start to get that diversity, that inclusion, that empathy, that openness, that curiosity into the design process, into the development process, into how we make cities, we start to get a result that's much more exciting, that's much more inclusive, surprising, and it's just something that I think we all want. And we know of spaces that that allow for all sorts of different types of uses, or that have small things that make a difference for certain populations, and we can feel that, and we know that it happens either intentionally or by design, or it doesn't happen at all. It's not something that will just happen by happenstance. So it needs to be very intentional, and I think it's more about the process. About who's included in the process, who's a part of it, and letting go a bit the outcome. And I think that that's a bit difficult as a design community, but that's where we can really make a big difference. We definitely don't have to ditch everything from the past. There's a lot to take from the past. I think maybe one of the great things are mainly cities pre-cars. I think if we think back to how cities were created in a much more organic manner as well, a lot less top-down sort of planning about it, depending on the city, of course, but and less car-oriented, we already have something that's much more interesting. Then the idea is not to just go back to that, but there's a lot that we've learned along the way that we can also do. I think another aspect of ditching reference man is going from only being people-centric to being more life-centric. And that's something where, of course, beyond the car and everything, but having spaces that are much more nature inclusive. And that's we're still, working on what that means for a city, how we can let nature come through the city doors and be a part of the urban city fabric, and what that does for our well-being, what it does for the well-being of the planet, and how we live in harmony with the natural processes. We know that it's something that makes us feel better. It makes us less sick. It makes us healthier. It makes us mentally healthier. It has such great benefits for us as humans, but then also for the planet. We know that cities are already quite biodiverse because there's food, there's things, there's all sorts of things happening. So it does attract certain animal or different flora and fauna. But if we can really incorporate it and make sure that that they're living in harmony, then it's so much richer. And that's something that is taking from the past, but then really amplifying it. And another thing with that is so going beyond people-centric to life-centric. But that doesn't mean then leaving out the people, of course, because we know that that greening our cities also has a social component to it, other than the health aspect and well-being, but can lead to green gentrification. So there's also an aspect about it of making sure that we still take care of our of the populations that need it the most, and that can be outed out of their neighborhoods thanks to nice nature inclusive and green infrastructure or policies that are on one hand excellent, but then so nature inclusive, but then socially exclusive. So it really is about creating that good balance between the two, making sure that people have the opportunity to return, that there's enough affordable housing when the prices go up, that there's policies that make sure that people who lived there, the communities that were there already, can remain and can thrive alongside the nature. So it's about balancing those two. But I think that that's something that learning from the past we can take into our cities, but having a lens of really this inclusive aspect. And that's the only way we can create a just transition when we're dealing with the climate crisis. I see the archtivist architect as going really beyond ego. And I think that in the traditional way of being an architect, there is a bit of an ego issue. Even when we think of the Pritzker Prize, I mean, it's about celebrating one architect every time, or a pair, or a trio, who are at the head of a company where there's lots of other people, but the Pritzker goes to that one founder or founders, and that's already a way of seeing architecture where it's about one person, or this top designer who knows it all and has all the ideas or all the ingenuity in their head, and we should revere this person, this architect who has done these masterpieces. And I think the archtivist architect is not like that. It's much more a facilitator, a listener, someone who practices empathy, and who isn't so much about being in the spotlight, but more seeing how to coordinate, how to facilitate processes to be able to create more inclusive and resilient cities. And of course, agreed. I think that the architect has an important role, and that it shouldn't be that there shouldn't be any architects, let's say. But I believe that there's a lot of value that community members or different decision makers within the process, or different stakeholders, different perspectives have, and that one person has their biases, has their upbringing, has everything that they take with them, which I think is important and should be used. But you have to understand that that there's more out there. There's other perspectives that sometimes make it hard for you to understand who you are as a designer, as an architect. But that taking all of that in is an important part of the process, and an important part of being an archtivist. So it goes well beyond being the architect, with a capital A that is here to save everyone. I think it's much more about, this facilitator role, empowering others, connecting others. Our profession is always working with a myriad of stakeholders, and in a sector that's quite fragmented. So I think that taking on that role of being the glue, being the binding actor and change maker that can try to understand the different perspectives from the different professional bodies that we have, that have very different ways of seeing a building or a city in the end, as well as the different stakeholders that will work there, walk past there, come there on holiday or whatnot, and bringing all that together for a better result. It's a tough task. I think it's not simple, and we'll all have different angles or different things that we'll focus on. And I think that that's okay. We can't do everything. Each designer cannot, take on every single social, environmental, circular, technological, entrepreneurial issue on and address it. But as we take on these different angles and we try to coordinate and facilitate discussion and understanding between the different stakeholders, then I think we have an archtivist that can really be a part of creating the impact, be a change agent, and empower others to make the city all together.